Welcome to this workshop on just war and pacifism, and are they really diametrically as opposed as we often think they are? Or can there be some common ground between the two of them? Those are some of the questions we'll be looking at in this session. Rob Arner, I'm a professor at Reformed Episcopal Seminary, and I am on the board of Consistent Life Network. And I wrote a book in 2010 entitled Consistently Pro-Life, The Ethics of Bloodshed in Ancient Christianity.
And it's wonderful. You haven't read it. I love it.
So,
the book, not the bloodshed.
I wanted to start by just doing a very, very, very basic overview. I'm rooted in the Christian tradition, so my approach to pacifism, I am a pacifist, comes from my convictions about Jesus, what he said, what he taught, how he lived. So I'm just going to present you some very, very basic introductory passages from the New Testament that show a little bit about why the early Christian church for the first 3 centuries rejected all killing. The most basic place to start is the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. It's the largest block of Jesus' teachings in the Bible, and one of the things he does, talks about all these great topics, at the end of chapter 5, he does something pretty radical. He quotes the law of Moses that says that you could seek revenge up to a 1-for-1 retribution. And he says, no, actually, that's really not God's will for your life. So, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now, there's a lot of unpacking that needs to be done for a proper exegesis of this passage, but I don't have time for that. Just, it's against retribution. Notice, the one who hurts you, you do good to that person. Because why? That's what Jesus did. How did Jesus treat his enemies? He loved them and laid down his life for them. So, love your enemies is a key teaching of Jesus. And this is, it's not just Jesus, but it's also echoed in Paul's letters. Romans chapter 12. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. So, according to Paul, following Jesus, revenge is not a human prerogative. It's in the hands of God if God wants to do it. So Jesus laid down his life, taught love of enemies, and the early Christian church took that and ran with it. And what you're going to see in my part of the presentation is that the Christian church of the first 3 centuries rejected all killing in all circumstances, from abortion to war and everything in between. And I've put together a few of those quotes from the early Christian writings that document this. So, there have been a lot of studies on the early church and military service written. And I contend that those studies that focus on the question of whether there were Christians in the Roman legions in the first 3 centuries, it misses the forest for the trees. Military service was not the main issue for the early Christians. It was killing and idolatry, primarily. that the Christian church found objectionable about a life in the Roman military. And I want to show that, especially with respect to their contentions about the incompatibility of killing somebody and following Jesus. So, in my research, I set out to answer this question. What did the first Christians, after the Bible was written, think about killing people? And I read in translation all of the surviving Orthodox Christian literature from before the year 311. Now, why the year 311? Why was that a cutoff point? Anybody know your history?
That's
Yes.
the date.
That was when the Emperor Constantine issued his Edict of Milan that stopped the persecutions of the Christians. And from that point on, the Christianity began to become more and more and more favored by the empire until it was made the official religion of the Roman Empire. And the church went from being a persecuted, powerless minority within Roman society to being the powerful, privileged elite, the ones who called the shots, and eventually the ones that did the persecuting. But I'm going to look at the period of time before that. I wanted to answer, what do these texts suggest about early Christian teaching about killing? And my overall conclusion was that, without exception, there were no exceptions that I could find, and I've asked Ron Sider in his book, no, he couldn't find any exceptions either. The teaching of the pre-Constantinian Christian church was categorically opposed to all killing, in any form, any human killing. Meat eating was permitted. Sorry, vegans. And I found that, many of the people that I tell that to find that conclusion hard to swallow. But I want to show you some of this. It's rarely wise to speak in terms of absolutes when doing historical research. I don't want to speak in absolutes, but honestly, the weight of the evidence compels me in this case. No Christian before the year 311 condones Christians killing people under any circumstances. The ancient Christian church forbade killing as incompatible with the moral life of Christian discipleship. Why? Why? Not just because Jesus said so, but there are theological convictions at play here. The underlying idea was that human life does not belong to us. Everything that we have is a possession given to us in trust by God. That our land, our houses, our property, even our very bodies, do not belong to us, but ultimately belong to God. And whether we honor God with our bodies, as Romans says, or whether we take those possessions given to us in trust and abuse them, that's the knife's edge. So human life in the early Christian conviction belongs to God, and it is wrong to take it. As its creator, only God has that prerogative. And actually, to kill someone who the Genesis 1 says is made in the image of God is to commit idolatry. Because it says that we are God. It puts us in the place of God. So that's the theological convictions here. I want to get to my quotes because you'll find these really interesting. But if you have any quick questions, you can stop me. So, what did they say about abortion and infanticide? Following Michael Gorman's great book, Abortion in the Early Church, we discover that both the exposure of infants and chemical or surgical abortions were very commonplace in the Roman Empire. They were very much pro-choice. But One key difference was that in the Roman Empire, it wasn't the woman's choice. It was the man's choice. The man determined whether or not this child was going to live or die.
So the man of the household.
Yes, yeah,
So
yeah. The father or the husband, the paterfamilias.
Because I was trying to establish, just to distinguish whether that resided in the family or in the state, as it were.
It was in the family. The legal authority to kill or let live a newborn child or a child in the womb was in the hands of the paterfamilias, the head of the household. But and if anyone did anyone ever read the play Oedipus Rex? Yeah, if you're familiar with, you know about Oedipus being abandoned on the mountainside to die, and through this wacky case of mistaken identity, he gets rescued by a shepherd, and that's the whole premise of it. That was a common practice. If a baby was born and there was something wrong with it, or it was a girl and they wanted a boy, or if they just simply had too many mouths to feed, they would take the baby and leave the baby on the mountainside to die. And the Christians would routinely patrol those mountainsides and try to save as many of those abandoned babies as they could. It was a value that was radically in contradistinction to the killing that the empire valued. So Christians opposed the killing of unwanted children either before or after birth. For them, abortion and infanticide were two sides of the same coin. There was no difference, and you'll see that in some of the quotes that I have.
You mentioned in Christians here. I'm also mindful from this book that a lot of what the Christians adopted as their aversion to abortion or infanticide was an outgrowth of Jewish ethics of the time.
That's true, yes, that's right.
It's a continuation, like so much of early Christianity.
You're exactly right. This was a value that was shared with Judaism at the time, too. Judaism was a tolerated faith in the Roman Empire because it was perceived to have its origins before the founding of Rome, whereas Christianity, they were the new kids on the block, and they were not tolerated. So, a couple quotes from the early church. This first one is from the earliest known Christian discipleship manual called the Didache, or the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. It states very simply, do not kill a fetus by abortion or commit infanticide. Pretty straightforward. Notably, this is under the section of the Didache entitled The Way of Death. You don't want to follow the way of death. So, in another early writing, a Christian apologist who was writing to defend the faith from wild accusations that some pagan critics made of the faith, that in their secretive worship gatherings where they ate the body and blood, their pagan neighbors thought they were cannibals, that they killed and ate their own children or children of their neighbors. But Athenagoras says, again, we call it murder and say it will be accountable to God if women use instruments to procure abortion. How shall we be called murderers ourselves? The same man cannot regard that which a woman carries in her womb as a living creature, and therefore as an object of value of God, and then go about to slay the creature that has come forth to the light of day. The same man cannot forbid the exposure of children, equating such exposure with child murder, and then slay a child that one has found to bring it up. No, we are always consistent, everywhere the same, obedient to our rule and not masters of it. So we don't make exceptions to this rule, he says. We don't kill our children. Justin Martyr, another famous apologist. We have been taught that to expose newly born infants is the work of wicked people, explaining to the Roman emperor what some of these Christian moral convictions are, and that, no, we're not as scary as you think we are, they thought.
When you say exposed, does that mean the mountains?
Yes, where they leave them out to die, of either be eaten by the wild animals or what have you. Yeah. Clement of Alexandria, in writing in the 3rd century. Women who resort to some sort of deadly abortion drug kill not only the embryo, but along with it, human kindness. The Greek word for human kindness there is philanthropia. Can't be philanthropic and commit abortions. From Origen, also a late 3rd century. God certainly requires us to bring up the offspring and not to destroy the children given by providence. Tertullian, late 2nd century, last decade of the 2nd century. But with us, murder is forbidden once for all. We are not permitted to destroy even the fetus in the womb as long as blood is still being drawn to form a human being. To prevent the birth of a child is a quicker way to murder. It makes no difference whether one destroys a soul already born or interferes with its coming to birth. It is a human being and one who is to be a man, for the whole fruit is already present in the seed. So, AKA, life begins at conception. There were Christians in the Roman legions, in at least from the year 175 on, but they weren't there as a result of Christians joining the Roman legions. They were there as a result of conversion. People were converting to Christianity in large numbers by the end of the 2nd century, and of course some of those were going to be in the Roman legions. So that presented a moral problem to the church, as we'll see. This, I think, is the key. I'm going to show you a text now that clears up the ambiguity of the historical data of why there were Christians in the military in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, but they were still against killing. This is from Hippolytus's apostolic tradition of the 3rd century, which most scholars believe was kind of an early church consensus document. This is the widespread practice of the church in the mid-3rd century. There's in this long section where Hippolytus is discussing certain occupations that are incompatible or morally questionable with the gospel of Jesus. There were some of these occupations were absolutely objectionable. You had to, if you wanted to join the church, you had to quit these jobs. These were jobs such as prostitute, sorcerer, priest of a pagan temple. You can't do that and be a Christian. You got to quit. Find a new line of work. Other jobs were morally questionable, but as long as you altered your behavior a little bit, you were allowed to stay. For example, a sculptor was one of these. Now, what's wrong with being a sculptor in those days? Yeah. They said you were allowed to stay. You were allowed to keep practicing your sculpture arts as long as you promised to never make an idol for a pagan temple. Seems pretty good, right? So, I'm going to show you 3 canons from this apostolic tradition. A soldier in command, and that was a euphemism for a low-ranking soldier, like a private or a sergeant. A soldier in command must be told not to kill people. If he is ordered to do so, he shall not carry it out, nor shall he take the oath, which was like idolatry. If he will not agree, he should be rejected from the church, from being, they weren't allowed to be baptized. Second one, anyone who has the power of the sword, or who is a civil magistrate wearing the purple, that was a symbol of power, of imperial power in those days, should desist or quit, or he should be rejected. So high-ranking military officials and Roman governors had to quit their jobs entirely if they wanted to join the church because of that power of the sword. It was the sword, the killing, that was objectionable. And finally, if a catechumen or a believer wishes to become a soldier, they should be rejected, for they have despised God. So the gate did not swing the other way. If a soldier converted they were allowed to remain in the ranks as long as they didn't kill anybody. But if a Christian wanted to become a soldier, they were excommunicated. Soldiers who converted to Christianity while in the army must agree to not kill anybody, even if ordered to do so. But they are permitted to remain in their occupation under those conditions. This was a grace extended to those soldiers, because what do you think would happen if a Roman soldier decided to just up and quit?
Be killed.
Yeah, they would be killed, and many were. We have records of soldiers who converted and decided that they couldn't soldier anymore, and they renounced their arms and died as martyrs. But that was not the expectation. The expectation was you could stay if you wanted to. But an imperial officer who has the power of the sword is not permitted. They had to step down, because that post was too incompatible with the gospel. And finally, Christians or catechumens may not join the army of their own volition. So it's pretty significant. Now, the church was not opposed to using military imagery or metaphors to describe themselves. It was specifically the killing. This was called the militia Christi imagery, or the God, or Christ's army. The church saw itself as a disciplined army for Christ. So they used the discipline of the Roman legions as a metaphor for what they wanted to be. Lactantius in the 4th century says that worship of God is a kind of heavenly military service. Interesting, despite their scruples against the military, isn't it? The church, Tertullian, calls God's militia. And this one's kind of funny. Tertullian in his Apology says, "We come together for a meeting in a congregation in order to besiege God with prayers, like an army in battle formation. Such violence is pleasing to God." That's the kind of violence God likes, when we attack him with prayers. Clement of Alexandria called the church a bloodless army. "But when the shrilling trumpet blows, it assembles the soldiers and proclaims war. And shall not Christ, think you, have breathed to the ends of the earth a song of peace? Assemble the soldiers of peace that are his? Yes, he did, and assemble, O man, by blood and his word, his bloodless army. And to them he entrusted the kingdom of heaven." Bloodless army. Kind of like that. If only the church were such today. Now here's a few bonus statements that are pretty categorical about killing. Jesus did not consider it compatible with his inspired legislation to allow the taking of human life in any form at all. Wow. Tertullian, writing in this treatise on the spectacles, what was the common sports in the Roman times? Gladiator games. They watched slaves fight to the death instead of going to the baseball game, you know. Yet did not the Creator design those creatures of his for man's destruction? Certainly not. He forbids manslaying by one summary commandment: "Thou shalt not kill." And finally, my favorite. This is from Lactantius, written in the year prior to probably at least, it was only about 5 or 6 years before the Edict of Milan. "For when God forbids killing, he not only prohibits us from freebooting or raiding, which is not permitted even by public laws, but he also advises us that things also which are regarded as lawful among men should not be done. So neither will it be permitted a just man, whose service is justice herself, to enter military service, nor can he accuse anyone of a capital crime, because there is no difference whether you kill a man with a sword or a word, since the killing itself is prohibited. Therefore, in this command of God, no exception whatsoever must be made. It is always wrong to kill a man whom God has intended to be a sacrosanct creature. It was pretty compelling and overwhelming. So, what happened? Why today pacifism is a very small minority stance even in the church today. Overtaken by just war theory and crusades and stuff like that. And what happened was the political realities of what does it take to run an empire. When Constantine began to favor the church by persecuting its adversaries, by building its own churches, by funding the church with the taxes he collected, how did that? The church was essentially running the empire. He surrounded himself with famous theologians, and the church began to exercise power. And is it possible to run an empire on an ethic of nonviolence? Can it be done? I don't know. I can't conceive of it. And so the church was faced with a dilemma. Do you accept this power and influence and privilege from this emperor? And if you do, something's got to give. The nonviolence of the gospel versus the necessary violence of running an empire, something's got to give. And what gave was the church's steadfast commitment to nonviolence. Thinkers like Ambrose and Augustine of the late 4th century began to offer theological justifications for when it might be okay for Christians to kill people. And that was the seeds of the just war theory. They reinterpreted the Sermon on the Mount, which I can talk about later, but I want to hand this off to John or Mary?
Mary.
Okay.
Okay. I'm Mary Liepold. I saw all your faces this morning, or for the most part. And I looked over at the PowerPoint and saw that Rob's talk had a nice title, so I was thinking if mine had a title, it would be something like How I Became a Pacifist in the Playroom and Why I Live in Hope. I'm not an expert in anything except perhaps the proper use of the semicolon and the elegant em dash. Thank you. But I have some strong opinions on war and peace and just peace. I arrived at them through my life, so I'm going to approach them in the form of autobiography for the most part, though later we get to some things that most of us here have lived through, possibly all of us. According to the family legend, I learned to read before I was 3, and right around that birthday I set my hair on fire, actually reading under the covers with a Swipe cigarette lighter.
Oh.
My big sister insists it's true. She saved us all. She swooped in and put it out. But my thirst for learning survived. I went to school and loved every minute of it, except for arithmetic. And my master plan from high school on was to earn my doctorate before I was 25, and maybe start looking at guys around that time, and marry at around 30 like my mother had done. And then this man came along, and he smelled right. It was my senior year of college. What happened instead is that when I was 30, oh, by the way, we've been married for 51 years, so it kind of worked out. Even though I even thought I was too young. My mom did, my siblings all did. I got blessed, I got lucky. And by the time I was 30, I had an ABD, which everything but the doctorate. You could get through coursework in a hurry in those days. And 2 kids I'd given birth to, the ones I call the homemade kids, and 2 kids we adopted. Early on, when I had a very colicky infant and a dethroned 2-year-old, very unhappy, I found that taking in a neighbor's 2-year-old made life enormously better for all of us. The 2 of them, in fact, the 2 of them would crawl into the playpen and the baby was free range. They could put the box in the playpen and it was... So it grew into a family daycare that I operated for 15 years. And I never got over being surprised when people handed me checks on Fridays because we were just having so much fun. And one of the things I figured out pretty quickly, well, first of all, kids, little kids, we all know they're beautiful, they are sweet, and they also arrive here needing a little enculturation, right? They've got a lot of things to figure out. So it wasn't always peaceful at my house. And I figured out pretty quickly that punishment just made things worse. It just didn't work at all. And of course, impunity doesn't work either. We all have a gut-grounded sense of justice, including 2-year-olds. So I thought there had to be some kind of third way. And there really, I hope that anything I'm going to say about this to the young adults and the young parents here is old news. But at that time, this was the mid-60s, there was not a lot around. So we're in the playroom, Joel has taken Nathan's truck, Nathan has unleashed all the nasty words he knows, Charlotte's getting whacked and just kind of for being in the way. And I'm being looked to for justice by those 3 and the other kids who are of course fascinated by the altercation. So I learned to say, okay, God, I would just take one deep, what are we going to do? And I have said I believe in original sin because of as a Catholic, I also believe in miracles. Because every time I would make that pause, a way was given. There was always some other way to do it. And usually it was to invite those 3 to express what they were feeling, what was going on for them, listen to them with all the attention and all the respect I could muster, and encourage them to extend that same respect to each other. And most of the time, that's all it took. Sometimes when it wasn't, we would all use our imaginations and our creativity to come up with a solution. And the solutions the kids came up with were so ingenious. And simple usually, but just delightful. And sometimes very silly, so the whole kerfluffle would dissolve in laughter. I read Chaim Janat around that time, and he had one sentence that has saved me in so many situations. Don't change a mind, change a mood. I'm sure you've all seen it work with adults too. It doesn't just work with kids. And then a little later, I read Johann Galtung, who's one of the fathers of peace studies, and he said something like, peace is nonviolence plus empathy plus creativity. And that formula covers so much. So the kids all grew up, and I did, and I eventually finished my doctorate, a PhD in poetry, that's the road to riches. By that time I could see, by the way, meeting Ron Sider here was an honor because for several decades the magazine The Other Side was my faith community. I went to church, but I really didn't know anybody who had the kind of wild ideas that I was cultivating, and it was tremendously important. But I could see that the punishment paradigm was going on all the way up the ladder. We have this so-called justice system, which I've heard described as a very expensive way to make bad actors worse. We have this war system, which has cost how many lives, how many refugees right now in the world. It just tears at all of our hearts. Has cost trillions and trillions of dollars and has produced nothing that looks like peace in human history that I could figure out. So, again, there have to be third ways. There has to be something between punishment and impunity. And I was graced to, well, first of all, here I am at 40. with a PhD and no work experience anybody recognizes. So what am I going to do? I don't want to take a job in academia because I'd be moving every year and I've got 4 kids in school. And what I found is that as an editor, you know this, you can read for a living, you can learn for a living. And I was able to work for a series of wonderful nonprofits where it seemed like I was picked up and put down just where I needed to be to learn what I needed to learn. And especially was able to talk to people and tell the stories of people who were in situations where they were winning nonviolently. I talked with women in the DRC, Congo, which is arguably still the worst place in the world to be a woman, who were standing together and confronting the violence and the hideous systems they were in. I worked for the Child Welfare League for a long time, and in that dysfunctional system found the shining heroes and could tell their stories. I was just so very lucky. And about that time, I learned about the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa and later Argentina, and was so excited because here you had the survivors being able to experience the dignity of telling their stories and being heard. And you had perpetrators being confronted with the harm that they had done, and you had new national narratives being created. And eternal peace did not descend from heaven any more than it did in my playroom. But there was a third way. And a little later on, I learned about the restorative justice paradigm, which I think there's at least one session on here. And I saw that truth and reconciliation as kind of one face of this much larger third way. And it was, I realized, if a child tore pages out of the picture book, they could tape them back in. It was sort of, it all fits together for me. It's been just such fun to see that. So I also got to learn, and this is where I think all of us have seen, in the Philippines in 1986, the nonviolent people power revolution that unseated Marcos. I got to spend 2 months interviewing someone who was part of that. The soft power, the violent revolutions, the color revolutions, and the Arab Spring, and a lot of them were crushed. But even the world's worst dictators right now know that soft power has to be taken seriously. There's something new here. At the same time, academic peace studies is blossoming in so many places. There are 2 sociologists, Maria Stephan and Erica Chenoweth, who have studied conflicts down from 1900 on. A lot of you are nodding and know this, and found that nonviolent resistance is effective twice as often as violent resistance. This stuff works. And with young people coming out of all these programs in conflict resolution and so on, and going to work for some cases the State Department and other governments, in skin in the game organizations like Nonviolent Peace Force, where they're actually interposing, in organizations that do peace education, which is, I think, the face of it all that speaks the most closely to me, and my very dear friends MJ and Jerry Park of Little Friends for Peace. But creating microcultures of peace by teaching children and their parents and their teachers and their coaches that there is a third way. And then women rising to power in so many places all over the world, so that cultures are seeing a little less swagger and a little more sway in the way the world works. And then for me as a Catholic, perhaps the most exciting thing is the conference that met in Rome in April of 2016 that was convened by Pax Christi International, the Pontifical Council on Justice and Peace, the Pope's own council, Mary Knoll and other organizations, sort of super organizations of religious men and women, and Pace Bene. Pope Francis sent very warm greetings, and his right-hand man, Cardinal Turkson, who was there for almost all of the meetings. Now, I know some of you are not Catholics, but if people know one thing about the Catholic Church, it tends to be that we don't like abortion, right? And I think Greg covered a lot of things this morning, so I don't really need to rehearse that. Except that it has been wildly inconsistent, I believe, as I said this morning, in making an exception for for war. So that's why this with Pope Francis is so exciting. There were 80 some people who attended the conference, carefully selected from 30 countries. And though I wasn't there, I believe that when most of them arrived in Rome, at least half of them expected that what would emerge would be an equivocal document like the 1988 Bishop's Peace Pastoral, which allowed for the possibility of nuclear deterrence. Because even Pax Christi people come in all shades of opinion. There are quite a few people who believe, as John is going to explain, that the just war theory has limited war and can continue to do so. There are those of us who think just war is just war, and would like to see it put in the same file drawer as the flat Earth theory.
You should give Bishop Dozier his credit for that one. He said that. Long time ago.
I heard it from Tom Brubeck, but okay, yes, I am not being scholarly and attributing as I should. I'll give you the footnote some other
Dozier was
time.
thought to be an outlier at the time.
He still
Among
is.
bishops.
He still is. There are other progressive peace Catholics who I know and respect who believe that it is not for them as outsiders working in conflict situations to tell the oppressed that they cannot take arms against their oppressors. And I respect that position. There are some I also know and love who I think are afraid to take a consistent position on war for fear of where it would lead on the abortion side. We are a Catholic church, not a unanimous one, and we are a Catholic peace movement. So the miracle that happened is that when those folks got to Rome, they heard testimony from all kinds of folks who lived and worked in conflict situations and had for decades and decades, and said in the long term, violence does not work. To choose just one, there was a Jesuit named Francisco de Rue who had lived and worked in Colombia for many decades. And like the people, the peace workers in Colombia were caught between the paramilitaries and the guerrillas. So he said that he himself had received countless death threats from the paramilitaries and had almost been executed by the guerrillas, had come within a hair's breadth. And of the peace team that he had fielded, 24 people had been killed by the paramilitaries and 3 by the guerrillas. And this was part of the testimony he gave. And there in the Magdalena Medio, when we were surrounded by violent groups, we discovered that there is no safety in weapons, that the only true and sustainable protection comes through trusting people, and that to win trust, we have to go through a long process of dialogue and mutual acceptance and unpredicted individual and social changes in the midst of uncertainties. So I believe the Holy Ghost was in those rooms, and the document that emerged, and an appeal to the Catholic Church to recommit to the centrality of gospel nonviolence, asserts, we believe that there is no just war. Too often the just war theory has been used to endorse rather than prevent or limit war. And suggesting that a just war is possible also undermines the moral imperative to develop tools and capacities for nonviolent transformation of conflict. Now, I have to emphasize that this was not an official church document. It was from the people to the church, not the other way around. But many of us are hoping that Pope Francis's next encyclical, to follow his beautiful and very readable Laudato Si, will be on violence and just peace, which is a term of art that.
What you're reading is the document that was produced right
An
after
appeal
that.
to the Catholic Church,
After
the
that.
document that
After
came
that.
from
After
that
that.
meeting, that's right. So, as I said, I live in hope, and I don't want to oversimplify. I know that global national conflicts are a little more complicated than the scuffles in my playroom. I know it won't be easy. I believe that peace building is harder than war making, But three really quick things. First of all, even if we were to scale up professional, skilled peace building to anything, to a quarter, a half of war making, it would be so much cheaper. It would, you think of the trillions we spend. Secondly, it does no harm that I've ever heard of, very much unlike war. And third, it's fun. Because it builds connection. It is the exact opposite of tearing things apart. So the long-range goal of peace building is radical culture change, growing us up from a society that prizes competition and domination, power over, to one that prizes creativity and collaboration, or power with, respectful, often joyful connection with other human beings and with the rest of creation. And you probably know that brain research, social science research, is demonstrating in recent decades that our most basic human drive is not sex, it's not territory, it's not even security, it's connection. What human beings want the most is to be connected. So I am honored to be connecting with all of you. I look forward to more. Thank you.
My name is John Whitehead. I'm on the advisory board of Consistent Life, and I'm also deputy editor for Life Matters Journal, which is a Rehumanized International magazine. I'm going to talk about just war theory today, and I'm going to do it from a slightly different perspective. Unlike Rob, unlike Mary, and I suspect unlike most of the people in this room, I'm not a pacifist in the conventional sense. I think just war theory is a valid way of analyzing questions of conflict among nations. I should also say I'm not, my background is not in philosophy, it's not in theology, it's not in scriptural studies. To the extent I have a background, it's more in political science. I tend to think about these issues. The relevance of this for me today is not about the differences in our perspectives, which I don't think we're going to resolve anyway here, is how pacifists and adherents of just war theory can connect. So as you said, it's all about connection. How we can find some points in common and how we can continue to build movement. Because the movement's all about talking to people with different perspectives, different ideas, reaching them where they are. I might call myself a practical pacifist, what's sometimes called the just war pacifist. Oxymoronic though that may be. I accept that war can be justified in theory, but adopt an attitude of extreme skepticism toward actual wars, especially wars the United States wages. And to some degree, just war theory guided me to this position. I looked at the principles of just war, and I looked at real-world conflicts, and I saw real-world wars did not measure up to the theory. I think that peace activists, whatever their precise philosophy, faith background, or no faith background, can use just war theory or similar principles in the same to bring people to the peace cause, the same way I was brought to the peace cause in that way. And I think just war theory may even offer advantages in reaching some unpersuaded people that absolute pacifism doesn't. Not everybody, but some. And I want to talk about what you might call multicultural just war theory, because while Rob was talking about Christianity, like Rob, Mary, I am Christian, I do come from that tradition, but there are other faith traditions that have their own analogs in certain respects to just war theory. And I think that can be useful common language in talking to people from different faith backgrounds. And there are secular variants of just war theory, which I also want to talk about. But in order to talk about this, I should review precisely what the principles of contemporary just war theory are. The school of thought has evolved quite a bit since its first formulation in the 4th century AD. And its incarnation today, there's no set official version of just war theory. There are variants of it, and they're not all religious. I saw a set of the just war principles set out in a contemporary political science book on international relations, on conflict resolution. What I'm going to say is, I think, broadly the consensus, contemporary consensus among those who describe just war theory. So contemporary just war principles fall into two categories. Those principles meant to determine whether or not going to war is justified, and those meant to determine whether or not the war once begun is being waged in a way that respects goods such as human rights. Now, the first question, whether going to war is justified, is the much more complex one, at least it has more principles associated with it. There's six. Sorry, I only have so many fingers on one hand. 6 principles or requirements determine whether or not going to war is just. Number 1, war must be waged by a government. Private citizens or groups cannot legitimately wage war. This is sometimes called the legitimate authority principle, the competent authority principle. The only organization with legitimate authority for employing organized lethal violence, which is what war is the government of an independent political community. And it doesn't have to be an empire, although that was the original context. It can be a nation, a city-state, or tribe. Only the people who are responsible for the well-being of such communities and are not subject to any higher authority, or earthly authority at least, have the right to use violence to ensure justice between the, well, that's a loaded term. They're the only ones who have the right to use violence. I'll just leave it at that. In other words, no vigilantism, no anarchy, no private citizens waging war because that's what they think is a good idea. 2, war must have a just cause, and the understanding of what constitutes a just cause has evolved over time. I think today the most widely accepted view would be that defense against an aggressor would be a just cause for war. A government is justified in going to war to defend itself, its own political community, or perhaps a vulnerable third party from aggression or oppression. By contrast, war for the purposes of territorial, economic, or political advantage, imperialism, does not have a just cause. War must be waged with the right intention, and there are different ways of understanding this, but I think the essence of it is the government that's waging war has to be waging war in pursuit of the just cause. We all know governments lie. As I.F. Stone said, the one rule of life is that governments lie. Governments say they're waging war for one reason, but it's actually for a different reason. Requires scrutiny, requires evaluation, and if governments are ostensibly defending against an aggressor, but are in fact pursuing, say, an imperial agenda, then the war does not have a good intention, it's not just. For all alternatives to war must be ineffective. This is the principle of last resort. And that's common sense. If the government can realize the just cause without resort to war, it should do so. Anything else would be crazy. 5, the war effort must be likely to succeed, so-called reasonable chance of success. It does make sense, even within the context of just war theory, to kill or to die with no hope of winning. And victory is never certain in war, but there has to be at least a reasonable, probable chance. And the benefits of victory must outweigh the costs. Wars can be won, but at such a terrible cost that it outweighs whatever it was meant to accomplish in the first place. Again, this is not something that can be determined with any precision or certainty beforehand, but you at least need to, policymakers should at least worry about it, try to evaluate it. So those are the principles for determining whether or not going to war is just. The other principles, how you wage war justly, there are 2. One is known as the principle of discrimination. And I think this is, of all the aspects of just war theory, I think this is the one that most of us, even if we don't believe in just war theory, can appreciate the gut power of. A warring power must never intentionally use lethal force against non-combatants, such as civilians or prisoners of war. To show the picture of a child killed in war is probably the single strongest argument that can be made against war. And to intentionally do that is wrong. It makes war unjust. And 2, the loss of life or other damage caused by military engagement should not outweigh the value of whatever the engagement's goal is. This is known as proportionality. We hear this invoked a lot so intentionally killing civilians and non-combatants is absolutely wrong if, in the course of military engagement, civilians, non-combatants are accidentally killed in huge numbers. That outweighs the value of the whatever the action is meant to accomplish. And this is the rise of that, or this principle is what is in mind when people use that ghastly euphemism, collateral damage, which is a horrible term, and whether you agree with just war or a pacifist, you should never use that term. But I'd also say proportionality can also apply just to soldiers. This year is the 100th anniversary, for the United States, of entry into the First World War. And that was a war characterized by enormous numbers of soldiers' lives being sacrificed to gain just a few yards or miles of ground, which is crazy from a just war perspective, the principle of proportionality. So these 8 principles, say yes, determine if you're a just war theorist, whether war is just. And you can say a lot of things about these principles, critically or otherwise. But I think there are 2 things to bear in mind. First, that are important to me. First of all, if all 8 of these principles are applied sincerely and carefully, I think it makes it really, really hard to actually justify real-world wars. At least that's my perspective. I find it very difficult to look at the actual wars waged in the world and say they're just by these criteria. And second, well, just war theory is clearly very different from pacifism in that it accepts, at least theoretically, that war can be just. Just war theory is not the only alternative to pacifism when it comes to thinking about war. And it's not even the one most different from pacifism, although the 2 are different. Something that pacifism and just war theory have in common is the belief that the behavior of governments, particularly in the area of international relations, should be subject to moral principles and restraints. Pacifists would say morality dictates rejecting violence altogether in international relations. A just war adherent would say that morality dictates using violence only under certain conditions. But both would agree, or should agree at least, that the organized violence of war cannot simply be used when reasons of state require it. And this sets just war theory apart from a third approach to international relations and military conflict. And I think it's the one that probably dictates the views of people in power most, which is realpolitik, which essentially views war as a struggle for advantage between political communities, which countries can make themselves stronger at the expense of others. And this will sometimes be justified on the grounds that unless you try to make yourself as strong as you can, then you'll become the victim of the aggression of others. It's a dog-eat-dog world. And questions of morality, human rights, justice, they don't have any place in decisions related to international relations. This realpolitik attitude is reflected in the saying that in times of war, the laws are silent. It was also aptly expressed by perhaps the preeminent theorist of realpolitik, Niccolo Machiavelli, who counseled heads of state that, quote, because all men are wicked and do not observe faith with you, you also do not have to observe it with them. I should say, I'm not suggesting that realpolitik, well, I think it's a deeply flawed and wrong philosophy. It doesn't always lead to nations going to war. Sometimes appreciating national interest, what is in a nation's best interest, can lead to nations avoiding war. But the school of thought doesn't leave much room for subjecting international relations to moral principles. And I think pacifism and just war, for all their differences, are far closer to each other than they are to realpolitik. I think this is one reason just war theory is useful to peace activists. I also think just war theory is useful because if we are trying to convince people who are on the fence or are not convinced in the evil of war, at least as it is actually practiced, I think just war theory mirrors to a greater degree than pacifism does how many people intuitively think about and talk about war and why people frequently oppose war. I grant that the fundamental premise of absolute pacifism, that all killing is wrong under all circumstances, is certainly clearer, more consistent than non-pacifist philosophies. But rightly or wrongly, I don't think this premise is one most people will easily accept, at least when you're first trying to win them over to a peace-minded attitude. If someone doesn't intuitively accept the premise of absolute pacifism, persuading them of it is very difficult in my experience. Some people, they see it instantly, clear as day, all killing is wrong. Some people don't. And trying to convince them otherwise is a question that involves a very high level of, I think, philosophical or theological abstraction to make it comprehensible. And I'm not saying that argument should be made. It may be that people can eventually be converted to that view who don't already hold it. But it does involve moving away from familiar ways of looking at war. And I think just war theory allows peace activists to argue against war on more familiar grounds that I think are more persuasive to some people, at least as a first step. Consider some of the criticisms someone might make of an actual war. The notion that a war is wrong because the nation we're going to war with has not attacked us, which was a very common and right critique of the 2003 Iraq War. It's in many ways a reflection of the just war principle of just cause. War is only justified to defend against an aggressor. The suspicion someone might feel that a head of state or other policymaker isn't telling the truth and hiding the true motives for waging war. I think that expresses the principle of right intention. People might not use this terminology, but I think that's what they're getting at when they raise these concerns. The fear that a war is unwinnable and will just be futile, that reflects realpolitik concerns, but it also reflects the principle of the reasonable chance of success. The belief that war is not necessary because nonviolent methods of resolving an international conflict are possible. That's essentially a version of the last resort principle. And the horror that we all feel, or should feel, on learning of the deaths of children, the elderly, or other vulnerable people in wartime, is consistent with the belief in the principle of discrimination. I think more people can understand and appreciate the power of these kinds of criticisms, at first at least, than of a complete rejection of all war in principle. Making these just war-inspired criticisms may succeed in persuading some people to oppose war, when criticizing war on the basis of an absolute rejection of violence would not so succeed. And I think if we're looking at this not as, in some cases, people of faith, or as philosophers, or at a level of pure principle, if we're looking at it from the perspective of political organizers who want to oppose a war or a particular policy, weaponry such as nuclear weapons, we want to get everybody on board, and we need a variety of arguments to make. And I think these kinds of just war-inspired arguments are one way of persuading people to build a coalition against war. And I should add something else. I don't want to run on and on, so I'll try to be as brief as I can. I think just war principles, or versions of them, have a very broad appeal because there are counterparts in non-Christian traditions. Just war theory originated, at least that term, the concept of that term attached to it originated in Christianity, but there are other religions, other faith traditions that have similar principles. The notion of war being subject to moral principles can be found in Hinduism. Professor Manoj Kumar Sinha, who's a law professor who was affiliated with the Indian Society of International Law, explained that Hindu tradition is a similar principle to that of last resort, the notion of seeking alternatives to war. He wrote, "Ancient India developed a method in 4 successive stages for the settlement of disputes between states. The first stage is called peaceful negotiation. The second stage consists of offering gifts to appease the enemy. The third is a veiled threat, and the last stage allows the use of force. The clash of arms in battle is therefore clearly undesirable as long as it can be avoided. The policy of conciliation and making gifts should be tried first before engaging in war." This is a common vocabulary that Hindus, or some Hindus, might appreciate in talking and critiquing war. Similarly, there's a body of Hindu law called the Law of Manu, which has a version of the discrimination principle between combatants and non-combatants. It says, "Persons walking on the road, not participating in the conflict, or mere travelers, or those who are engaged in eating or drinking or pursuing their special avocations or activities or diplomatic errands, and of course the Brahmins, unless they are engaged in war, were not to be killed." I also want to mention something that I think is very significant. This is from ancient Hindu mythology, but I think it has relevance today. In the Ramayana, Rama's younger brother, Lakshmana, gains access to a weapon so destructive it could destroy an entire race, even those who could not bear arms. Rama counsels his brother not to use such a weapon, even though their adversary Ravana is fighting an unjust war, because to do so is contrary to the ancient laws of war. It's a Hindu principle with a lot of contemporary application. Islam has similar principles about discriminating between combatants and non-combatants, and also about war being justified in response to aggression as opposed to other reasons. There are a lot of stereotypes and misconceptions on this, which I won't try to get into. Obviously, real-life Muslims have not always followed this, just as real-life Christians don't even follow just war theory, let alone pacifism. But there is the notion that war is justified, similar to the notion of just cause, in response to aggression, but not just to convert or to punish non-believers. The Quran says, "To those against whom war is made, permission is given to fight, because they are wronged, and verily God is most powerful for their aid. They are those who have been expelled from their homes in defiance of right, for no cause except that they say, 'Our Lord is God,' for being Muslim." However, the Quran also says, "But if they," meaning the enemy, "incline towards peace, do thou also incline towards peace, and trust in God, for he is the one who heareth and knoweth all things." So, not permanent war, make peace if there's no law, if the enemy shows signs of offering peace. There are similar passages, as said, about respecting the rights of non-combatants. The Quran says, "Fight in the cause of Allah those who fight you, but do not transgress limits, for Allah loveth not transgressors." Islam, some Muslim thinkers have also condemned nuclear weapons as being contrary to Islamic law about discriminating between combatants and non-combatants. And that's very important. Mohammed Munir, who's a law professor at the International Islamic University, interprets Islamic tradition to reach the conclusion the use of nuclear weapons and WMDs is totally prohibited in the Islamic rules of war because their use will undermine the principle of distinction in particular. I wish our own country was more Islamic in this respect. I should wrap up, but I want to tell one more story, and it's about a secular just war theorist. There's a political philosopher, I don't know how many of you know him, named Michael Walzer. He's a secular thinker. He's not guided by any particular faith tradition. But he is one of the foremost modern-day theorists of just war. And his embrace of just war principles arose out of opposition to war, specifically the Vietnam War. Walzer wrote, explaining the evolution of his thought, "In the 1950s and early 1960s, when I was in graduate school, realism, realpolitik, was the reigning doctrine in the field of international relations. The standard reference was not to justice, but to interest. Moral argument was against the rules of the discipline as it was commonly practiced. Just war theory was relegated to religion departments, theological seminaries, and few Catholic universities. Vietnam changed all this, although it took a while for the change to register at the theoretical level. The war became a subject of political debate. It was widely opposed, mostly by people on the left. These were people heavily influenced by Marxism. They also spoke a language of interest, a kind of realpolitik. They shared with the princes and professors of American politics a disdain for moralizing. And yet the experience of the war pressed them toward moral argument. Of course, the war in their eyes was radically imprudent, it could not be won, its costs, even if Americans thought only of themselves, were much too high. But these claims failed utterly to express the feelings of most of the war's opponents. Feelings that had to do with the systematic exposure of Vietnamese civilians to the violence of the American war. Almost against his will, the left fell into morality. And Walzer is very much a man of the left, so he's speaking of his own tribe here. All of us in the anti-war camp suddenly began talking the language of just war, but we did not know that that was what we were doing. Our anger and indignation were shaped by the words available to express them, and the words were at the tips of our tongues, even though we had never before explored their meanings and connections. When we talked about aggression and neutrality, the rights of prisoners and prisoners of war and civilians, atrocities and war crimes, we were drawing upon the work of many generations of men and women, most of whom we had never heard of. We would be much better off if we did not need a vocabulary like that. But given that we need it, we must be grateful that we have it. Without this vocabulary, we could not have thought about the Vietnam War as we did, let alone have communicated our thoughts to other people. I think as Walzer's experience demonstrates, just war theory can be, isn't always, but it can be a powerful means of criticizing war. A means that conventional realpolitik doesn't offer. And I think it's more, in some cases, it can be more accessible and immediately understandable to people who are not already on our side than pacifism. For these reasons, I think just war theory can be used as an aid in peacemaking. Thank you.
I found this very interesting. I'm a pacifist basically from birth, so,
Sure.
but the points you made, John, I think were really on point. And one thing that occurred to me, I'm thinking about today, there seems to be more anti-war activity from conservatives than from the left. You know, you got Ron Paul Institute, you got Patrick Cannon, you got antiwar.com, you got the American Conservative magazine, and you can go on, and people like Justin Amash in Congress. I don't think any of them are pacifists. They're all, I don't know what most of them talk that much about just war theory as a term, but I think I think sort of it's behind a lot of the criticism. So, you know, I don't know most of these people, the origin or how they developed, or they've always held these views, or what. But that's what struck me when you were talking about, you know, how can you talk to people who, you know, may not have the sort of context to easily accept pacifism.
Yeah. I mean, I suspect, I'm not terribly familiar with those thinkers either. I suspect in many cases people on the right who oppose war, it's part of a larger opposition to government power, the notion that war makes the government big, it overextends the nation. And if you're of a more social democratic bent, there's a problem with some of those attitudes. But I appreciate that's leading people to at least criticize war. I don't know how much just war theory has to do with it, but again, you don't have to know all the details of just war theory, or even necessarily believe in just war theory as a philosophy to appreciate the force of some of the arguments. I mean, Mary, as a pacifist, you said, I thought, some wonderful things about the alternative forms of dealing with conflict, how peacemaking is preferable to war making and dealing with conflict. And I think that's an argument a lot of people can feel the power of, whatever their background.
Sterling.
So this is the reference I'm a pacifist, but
Okay.
but I do agree with John a lot of things you said about that in real life. I think we have more pacifists and just work people have more in common than we do disagreements in terms of actual conflicts that come up. But my question is about what would your position be on conscientious objection? Do you think that there's an obligation for those who believe in a just war theory to refuse to participate in unjust war? Either to refuse to participate in the war at all if the war itself is unjust, or, and then of course in the war if they're ordered to do something that's unjust, to refuse that order.
Please.
Yes. Sterling, that's a very, very important point, that one of the things that just war theory entails, in fact requires, is, you could call it selective conscientious objection. The fact that the notion that if your moral analysis objectively as you can, determines that a proposed war or a proposed action in a war is unjust, you are morally obligated to disobey that, to refuse to go along with it. And current U.S. and I can't think of any nation in the world that does recognize this, but that is not permitted. There was during the Bush administration, there was a first lieutenant. His name was Aaron Watada. He was a Hawaiian-born veteran who was ordered to deploy with his unit to Iraq. He refused because he determined that the war in Iraq violated the just war theory at a number of points, and he felt morally obligated to refuse that order. Now, he was not a pacifist. He did not seek conscientious objector status. He, in fact, offered to be deployed to Afghanistan, which he determined was a more just war. But he was ordered to go to Iraq with his unit. He refused that order. It was a lawful order, so he was court-martialed and dishonorably discharged as a result. If just war theory is to be taken seriously, government has to enshrine a selective conscientious objection into law. Now, yes, that would make things a bit more chaotic.
So I understand. I know that it's not legally recognized, and I think that's a big problem. That's not legally recognized. But my question is more to John. Do you think that it's even if it's not legally recognized, is it there's still a moral obligation for people to defy the law in that case, if the law would require you to do something that's unjust?
I struggle on a theoretical level, and to some degree a practical level, with civil disobedience in general, because I acknowledge that, well, there's no question that if you put it in the abstract, if a law is unjust, you should defy it. I agree with that. I don't see anything wrong with that in principle. How that works in practice is very difficult because some people disagree on what is or is not a just or unjust law. And how that would work is complex. However, I would say if somebody feels in good conscience they cannot serve in a war, cannot do something in a war, or can't serve in the military, period, if there were, say, a draft step, then they shouldn't do it. I think following their conscience is the right thing to do. So yeah, I think in that case the person should engage in selective conscientious objection. I'll need to think more about the larger system of how you arrange things like that legally or ethically, but I think they should follow their conscience.
Mary?
First, I want to say I thought all three of you were outstanding.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
And I just want to add that as an open history major, that we should keep in mind the uses of history, especially on war and peace issues, because when you go back and look at all the wars fought, the results, the actual results, and all of the carnage and wasted lives, it's a very strong argument. And in the American context, when you look at the history of why we got involved in certain wars,
Right.
it's hard to find just wars.
I agree.
Right.
It's truly hard.
And
But I
since,
do think
since time is running out and you have the last word, I want to include one thing that I forgot to say, and that is the just war theory has been updated, I guess, from time to time, but I think two things have changed dramatically since it was last seriously looked at, and one is nuclear weapons. The nature of war has changed forever. Nuclear weapons and the internet, so that armies do not march forward in serried ranks anymore. It's the octopus and not the spider, you know. The other is that the alternatives have grown so powerfully. So I just wanted to put those two facts on the table. Thank you.
I thought that I think one of the moral aspects that leads people to pacifism is also sort of left out of the just war criteria is that the military-industrial complex represents this theft from the poor. That, you know, there's no, I mean, if you think about the priorities of humanity, of humankind, our greatest priority as a human family is to figure out more efficient ways to kill each other. And that's basically ignored in the just war criteria. I mean, only if there's an application, but the idea that militarism represents a theft from
As Eisenhower said.
and then it doesn't take into consideration the enormous environmental costs of just preparation for war. There's so many other factors that take us, that have to be considered morally in this equation that, you know, you're limiting it to the just war criteria as it was really stated, you know, by Augustine and with some little tweaks. But the bottom line is, you know, when the church bans the crossbow, you know, Augustine's spinning in his grave, right? Because we have weapons that could end the human experiment.
Right.
So it becomes a little bit more difficult to think about the application of something that's 1,600 years old now. I mean, I don't know if you want to speak to that, but it's...
Well, it's also the whole issue of the nation states aren't the warrior parties anymore. It's the tribals, you know, because of the colonization.
the war on terror, that's
So the whole state issue.
Or undeclared, our wars
Yeah.
undeclared.
Yes. Every war since what, Korea? World
War II.
And 85% of the dead have been non-combatants, according to what I've heard.
One more aspect of an updated just war theory that's in recent years, some theorists are proposing adding additional criteria to the just war theory that it's called the use post bellum criteria, that justice after war, that the victors of the war have an obligation to rebuild the nation they just destroyed. That they have to, because look what happened after World War I, when the unjust peace imposed on Germany in the Treaty of Versailles is explicitly cited by the Nazi Party as a grievance that justified their rebuilding and launching their offensive against the the rest of the world.
But rebuilding the state, though, it assumes that we're going to recreate the boundaries that were set by the colonial powers. I mean, it's just sort of like, so.
The most common critique of the just war theory that I hear from pacifists is that it is used to basically as an apologetics for war, using it as an excuse for war and whatnot. And I'm just curious because I'm genuinely curious and not well informed because I haven't really seen that myself. I mean, I've certainly heard people saying nationalist lines as in our cause is just and things like that, but actually delving into the criteria and things like that, I haven't really seen personally. So where is that done?
It's been taken into international law. A good deal of
To
it
some
has.
extent. I mean, the Geneva Conventions try to incorporate the whole notion of discrimination.
Well, there were 4 Christian leaders. Which war was that? Was that Iraq or was that Gaza? Who declared it a just war? The Christian leaders, even though by any rational reading it is, but and so it has been.
Sure.
They have been used not exactly by the government, but by those who were quickly came to support the government.
Yeah, I want to say 2 things about that. I think, and this connects to something you said, Larry, I do think, I mean, I said I am in many ways a practical pacifist. I do think that, I think just war theory provides a useful vocabulary for criticizing war and explaining why war is unjust. I don't necessarily know, however, if at this stage it really makes sense to go around applying the criteria to real world wars and say, well, is this one just, is this one just, in the hopes we'll find a just one. I do believe, as somebody who's not an absolute pacifist, our goal has to be to end war. I don't think we can say, well, we'll wage some wars but not others. And to the extent people still say, well, it could still happen, we'll keep applying the core criteria and maybe one war will measure up. I don't think that's adequate. However, there's something I want to share, which is that the power of people to make war is very strong and can overcome even the best convictions. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Jains, the Hindu offshoot of the Jains. Or the
Gandhi
was he? Okay.
mother was anyway.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Thank you. They're the most non-violent people on the planet. They don't believe, not only do not believe in killing animals, they don't believe in killing plants, and will take great care not to inhale insects, anything like that. In Indian history, there have been military commanders who were Jains. There was a Jain named Chamundaraya Karnataka in the 10th century who fought wars. He was described as like an elephant putting a herd of deer to flight. And in the 12th century, there was an Indian king who was served by 8 Jain military commanders. I think sometimes you can even have the most strongest absolutist convictions, but the power of war and war making can overcome even those. So we need to do more than just have the correct ideas.
My contention with Kyle's point is that a lot of times it's ignorance of the just war theory that is the biggest problem, because all people know is that, oh, I'm not a pacifist, therefore I believe in the just war theory, therefore I can justify war. But if we taught people what the criteria of the just war theory are and what moral duties go along with that, I think that pacifists and just war theorists could make common cause about 95% of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, John, I'm a pacifist. It took me a long time to learn, but I really appreciated your argument. And I've actually, as a pacifist, used your argument that we need the just war principles to talk to other people. When the build-up for the Iraq War was happening, I actually proposed to Pax Christi and a bunch of Pax Christi that we have a discussion. And some people were like, no, we can't do that. And I was like, you tell me how we're going to move people from where they are now to pacifism in time to stop this war. And one of my favorite writers on this now is Terry Wren that Mary had speak in D.C. a few months ago, and I didn't know about this guy in 2016. He's a peace studies guy and is a biblical exegete, and he's brilliant. One of the things he says in his book, Jesus the Peacemaker, is, and I'm not quoting this exactly, but the debate of just war versus pacifism is giving way to a conversation about peace building and peacemaking. Because I think what you said was in common, that the last resort thing is, as we're learning, like Chenoweth's work, as we're learning about what can be accomplished with nonviolence, and talk about that, then we can even not even have to get to is the war justified, because we can resolve things earlier.
And everybody please Google just peace, because it's an exciting, important concept.
Along those lines, I've heard someone comment that the problem with both sort of pacifism and just war theories, the focus is on the war, as opposed to Jesus saying, let's sort of the peacemaking, where the focus is on actively producing peace.
Yep.
Yeah, so I was going to talk about a different byproduct of the just war, and that has to do with evangelism. My parents were nonviolent activists that were atheists, and they raised us to believe that Catholics were very evil people. And the only way that I overcame that was by reading what the apostles did. I already knew that Jesus was this perfect thing, but what the apostles did. And I cannot bring my family and a lot of people into the church because it is such a violent church. They're not hedonistic people, they're not materialistic people, but they cannot tolerate that I belong to a cult that promotes violence. So I see it as a de-evangelizing impact on some really good people who can't get past that.
It's what for my, again, I just finished grad school recently, so but for my studies what it was how the professor presented it, is that the Abrahamic religions are all violent. All of them. So Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. That is just part of the DNA. And it was really interesting in listening to the arguments on that is.
But no, it's not. They all have a majority tradition. It's what the right hand of God and the left hand of God. Who is it? The
Martin Luther, Augustine.
Well, also the Tikkun guy uses that. But yeah, there's always been the sort of justice tradition and the mercy tradition, and the justice war thing has been dominant. But the other has been in all three major Abrahamic religions.
Well, although I do have to say, I mean, yes, that is correct. That those three religions do have very violent histories. I think most religions have very violent histories. Hinduism has a very violent history. As odd as it may seem to say, there are Buddhists who are violent. It's a problem even today. What?
What's the Buddhists doing to the Rohingya?
Right. Yeah. There's a quite possibly a genocide being perpetrated right now in a Buddhist majority nation by the Buddhists against a Muslim religious minority. So Myanmar, yeah. So throw your stereotypes out the window with that one. And of course, if you look at the history of communist nations, there are nations that have no religion at all that have very violent histories. I mean, violence is just a sickness that is pervasive in humanity, and yeah, we need to cure it.
Einstein called it the measles of mankind.
That's very good.
Walter Wink says it's the greatest consensus or agreement on the planet.
When Patrick talked about the lion's share of all human resources going to war, once I was at the United Nations and I saw a chart on the wall that showed this huge pyramid teetering on its little skinny base. And it was all the top of the pyramid. I mean, there was all the expenditures and all the world. But human needs were down here on this little bitty base, and war was up at the top. It was an unforgettable image.
When you think of a NATO, the NATO treaty that requires all of the countries that participate to contribute a minimum of their GDP to war military expenditures, that's part of the issue. Sorry.
James, please.
Yeah. So I mean, I grew up Mennonite, and my great grandpa was hard and feathered for refusing war and by his community, and so that tradition has been pretty steadfast in my family. However, there's always this malignment of just war theory. I think it's always, and now as I've sort of understood it and grown up to understand it better, I feel like that shoots yourself in the foot, because there's a lot in just war theory, obviously, as we've discussed, that aligns with pacifism. And I think that instead of maligning the other, one as not intervening, you wouldn't even save your family or whatever, and the other one saying, they're warmongers or whatever. I think it's better to have these conversations and come together and agree that war is bad and we should stop it. And instead of maligning just war theorists or whatever, we should instead say hold them accountable to what their beliefs actually are supposed to be.
Yeah.
And if we do that, I think that you'll have. I think we can actually get it because Catholicism is rife with just war theory. Thomas Aquinas, but Thomas Aquinas has a very robust idea of what it is. And it's appealing to all these natural law theorists that are out there. You can easily take down the institution of war from a moral perspective if you just appeal to those systems and ideas and try to have that shared space together. So I don't know, but
Yeah.
just want to put that out there.
Well
Thank
said.
you. Very well.
Thank you.
Was it in the First World War your grandfather, or great grandfather?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, there was
his first section. It was one of those.
Yeah, persecution of Mennonites in the First World War.
Yeah.
It's a terrible story. Others?
I just want to say one of the things I think wholeheartedly is that the basics of this is the commodification of the human being. The human being is just a commodity, and so you look at Bhopal, India, and the killing there, and just all these things. It's the commodification, and until a human being is held in dignity, their job they go. They go to the army. So.
Yeah.
I think this is the time we're supposed to break, isn't it?
I think
Yeah.
we're really
Thank you all.
past it.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you.
thanks everybody.
So we have to find a different way to approach these things, and that doesn't mean we have to work on all of them at the same time, but at least to recognize how they're related.